Mesdames et messieurs, je vous souhaite la bienvenue. My name is David Eidelman. Je suis vice-principal aux affaires médicales et doyen à la faculté de médecine. I'm the vice principal health affairs and dean of the faculty of medicine. Welcome here to the MNI and McGill University. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the latest installment of the Andrew F. Holmes Dean of Medicine Distinction Lectures. So we're proud to host this lectureship in Dr. Holmes' name. He was one of the 4 co-founders of the Faculty of Medicine and the first dean. And we use these lectures to provide a forum for stimulating academic exchange. The goal of the lectures is to salute individuals who are outstanding in the health sciences, at the same time as celebrating the scholarship that is really the backbone of all we do in education, research, and healthcare at McGill. We try in these lectures to open the doors to undergraduate students, graduate students, the general public, and the hope is that everyone will learn from the exchange of ideas and topics at these lectures. I want to acknowledge the Rose Weiselberg Foundation for the general support which makes these lectures possible. Rose Weiselberg, for those of us who are in the respirology field, was one of the first female respirologists in Canada, and somebody that is very celebrated in our little community. And we're thrilled to be welcoming and to recognize today's guest lecturer, a world-renowned neurologist, Dr. Antoine Hakim. So he actually didn't start out as a doctor. He started out as an engineer. Nobody's perfect, I guess. But he began his medical training at the young age of 29. That's about 10 years after I started mine. And went on to complete his residency in neurology here at the MNI, and then went to the University of Ottawa in 1992, where he now holds the title of Emeritus Professor of Neurology. He is one of the world's most renowned experts in stroke and a visionary behind the Canadian Stroke Network, which is a national cadre of researchers and clinicians representing universities, government, and nonprofit organizations with the goal of alleviating the burden of stroke on individuals, families, and societies. As CEO and scientific director of the network, Dr. Hakim and his team championed the Canadian Stroke Strategy in 2005 in partnership with the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, which has resulted in almost every Canadian province adopting a stroke strategy. And in fact, here at the Neuro, which is very different than when you left, this is now a tertiary stroke center. You once told me you left here because nobody was interested in stroke. So things have changed, and that's largely thanks to you. We're glad. So with regard to that strategy, just as an example, within 5 years, Ontario alone saw stroke patient admissions decrease by 11%, referrals to stroke prevention clinics increased by 34%. In addition to that achievement, he's also the founding CEO and scientific director of the Heart and Stroke Foundation Center for Stroke Recovery. He's a prolific author. He's written more than 130 peer-reviewed articles, and in 2017 he penned a book titled Save Your Mind, 7 Rules to Avoid Dementia, which was published in both English and French. His brilliance in this, he's stuck. If you get one of these lectures, you have to listen to the whole introduction. Dr. Hakim's brilliant and distinguished career has been recognized with numerous honors, including the Thomas Willis Lifetime Achievement Award for the American Stroke Association in 2007. The same year, he was appointed an officer of the Order of Canada. And in 2013, he was inducted into the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame, and he was most recently recognized with the Canada Gairdner-Whiteman Award in 2017. So it is truly a privilege and an honor for us to have him here with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Tony Hakim.
A lovely introduction, and I'm very, very honored to be here. This is a bit like being home. Being in this auditorium is exactly like being home. Most of the time I sat in those chairs and somebody was lecturing. And so it's lovely to see you all, and I'm looking forward to having a little chat with you about how we can protect our brain. It didn't seem like everybody was excited about this lecture. I stopped in the bathroom on the way over here, and on the little machine that spews out hot air to dry your hands, somebody put a little sign that said, "And now for a lecture from Tony Hakim." So I hope there won't be too much hot air coming out of this auditorium. I also have to show this slide about my conflicts of interest. Am I on the take from a drug company? So I just want you to know that it makes me very sad that no one has tried to bribe me to say anything particular in this lecture. So we do want to talk about protecting our brain, and the biggest message that I have, and this is a summary of my entire talk, is that you and I have the ability to reduce our risk for dementia, which is something that until a few years ago was not really part of the vocabulary that we used. We thought you became demented because you got old. You became demented because you got Alzheimer's disease. You became demented because God hated you. And so the reality is that you and I have the ability to modify, reduce our risk for dementia. Because, as this slide shows, many of my slides are quite busy, so I will give you the sort of gist of the slide so that you don't have to read every word on there. But as this slide shows, dementia is a significant problem. There are about 1 million Canadians who are suffering from some degree of dementia, half of those very seriously. And the last line is the one that keeps me up at night, which is that in 2040, that's what, 22 years from now, in 2040, the cost of caring for dementia alone will be more expensive than our entire current healthcare budget. And Mr. Trudeau needs to hear this, because this is a very significant tsunami coming upon us shortly. You have tried to go to the fridge to get something, and by the time you got there, you forgot what you were there for. I just want you to know that you have nothing to worry about. That is a common problem, and the proof that it is nothing to worry about is that when you took a few steps back and you traced your step, you remembered what it was that you went to the fridge for. And that is something that just says you're a busy person with lots of things on your mind, but you don't have a memory issue. Nonetheless, there are memory lapses that can become significant over time. And while they are in the MCI phase, and that is mild cognitive impairment, it means that you're still able to carry on with your daily activities without a problem. And at that point, it is still reversible. You can do something about it to regain your memory function. Once it gets into stage number 3, it becomes much more difficult to reverse and regain memory function. So this is the important 3 categories of difficulty, cognitive difficulty, that we need to keep in mind. That you can't let it go for too long, because after a while, it's not possible to push the boat back upstream. There are many types, but we keep hearing, that Alzheimer's disease is the condition that accounts for 2/3 of cases of dementia. And I just want to say that increasingly, we do not think, please don't go out of here and say, I heard a lecture today where Dr. Hakim says he doesn't believe there is such a thing as Alzheimer's disease. There is Alzheimer's disease. It just isn't, and it is the accumulation of proteins that are toxic to the brain. And some people, still Alice, the lady who wrote the book, some people have a genetic predisposition towards this, but it is not the case of the majority of people. And there is more to the story than just Alzheimer's disease, but I'm not denying the existence of that condition. Here is what Alzheimer's disease is all about. It is the accumulation of proteins that do not dissolve, that accumulate in the cells, and they cause the death of these cells. They are toxic to the brain, they're toxic to blood vessels, and some people have that predisposition. The rest of us have this protein, but we manage life very well and have good memory despite the proteins that have accumulated in the brain. Here is the first evidence that that made us begin to ask the question, so is dementia more than Alzheimer's disease? Is dementia more than the accumulation of these toxic proteins in the brain? They did a study where people had died and they had been signed out as being suffering from Alzheimer's disease. And so they looked at 5,715 cases, and lo and behold, a great percentage of them, in addition to having these proteins accumulating in the brain, also had a lot of vascular disease. There were blood vessels, both large and small, that had been occluded in the brains of these people. They had hearts that hadn't worked. They had legs that had blood clots in them. And so gradually we began to think that vascular disease, particularly vascular disease of the brain, plays a role in causing dementia, that it is more than just the accumulation of proteins. I'm very proud of this graph for a number of reasons. It is a graph that is produced by the Montreal Neurological Institute, and it has some very important messages in there. So let me go through it. So number one, these are healthy controls. So the graph starts by looking at you and me, healthy controls. And it goes into early mild cognitive impairment, late mild cognitive impairment, and late onset Alzheimer's disease. So as you go from left to right, this dementia is getting worse and worse and worse. And what they did is, for each cohort, they looked at all of these things. Is there deposition of those proteins in the brain? Is there metabolic abnormalities in the brain? Is there vascular disease? And they tested them for memory function. And they looked at the CSF for all of these abnormalities. And then they drew this graph. What is the very first thing that goes wrong that takes people from healthy controls to mild cognitive impairment all the way to late onset Alzheimer's disease? What is the first thing that goes wrong? Blood flow to the brain goes down. Your brain, as we will see, is this incredibly hungry pig for energy. It demands energy. And what brings it energy? It's blood flow. And if blood flow begins to go down, the brain starts having trouble. Here is a picture of all the blood vessels in your entire body. Whatever part is more red, it has more blood vessels. And you can see exactly what I see, which is your brain. And it says on the right-hand side, each brain contains 600 kilometers of blood vessels. And these are particularly tiny blood vessels. Why? Because the brain needs them all. The brain wants every cell to get energy. And so there has to be all of these capillaries, these thin, small blood vessels that have to bring blood to every last cell in your brain. Don't go messing with that, because there is a price to pay when that happens. So we're going to talk about all of that. People started asking the question, well, so if it isn't just the accumulation of proteins in the brain, what is it? What conditions are associated with dementia? And we're forever indebted to Debbie Barnes, who in 2011 said, what are the factors that contribute to dementia? And North America is a bit different from the rest of the world for a variety of reasons, which you will see. Number one, if you don't go to school, and there is many more people who don't go to school in the rest of the world than in North America, your brain is not pushed and is not activated and isn't pushed to remember things through your courses and classes. And so there is a bigger association of dementia with low education in the rest of the world than in North America. But even in North America, the message is educate, educate, educate. Push your memory to remember things, no matter how old you are, by the way. It isn't just about getting a BSc. It's about continuing to use your brain even though you're now 75 years old. So education at all times is absolutely essential. We're going to say a lot more about that. Smoking is associated with dementia. Sitting on your ass all day long is associated with dementia. If you're sad, that brings memory difficulty. High blood pressure is a major problem with dementia, diabetes and obesity. And so these are, as you see, so wait, Dr. Hakim, do you mean to say that if I'm not obese, I treat diabetes or don't get it because I'm not obese? I take care of my blood pressure, I keep in touch with my friends, and I keep smiling and not avoiding depression. I move, I don't smoke, and I continue to educate myself. I have a lower chance of becoming demented. The answer is yes. And we have just looked at all of the factors that are under your control to avoid this problem. And this is the message. Except for the small minority, we used to think it's a majority, except for the small minority that the lady who wrote the novel Still Alice belongs to, which is genetically inherited predisposition for the accumulation of these toxic proteins in the brain. And those people get their dementias in their 50s and late 50s, early 60s. If you're past that, your biggest risk is vascular. So, Dr. Hakim got very excited about this, and in a moment of folly and inattention, decided to write a book about it. I do not recommend it for any of you. And if you want, I will give you details of why I'm saying that. So I'm never going to do this again. I have written a book in which I said, here are the 7 rules to keep your brain active as you get older. Number 1, do not stop memorizing. Do not stop thinking. The earlier and the more varied the stimulation, the better. If you do Sudoku all day long, it's not going to be enough. If you do crossword puzzles all day long, it's not going to be enough. The brain wants variety and persistence. Because if there is a little spot in your brain called Sudoku, and you do Sudoku all day long, it's going to get a little bit bigger, but it doesn't talk to any other parts of your brain. So the brain wants variety and wants persistence. Number 2, we're going to talk about stroke, but it's very important to avoid strokes, and we're going to talk about that. That's how I'm going to get into stroke, is through that. Number 3, vascular risk factors, particularly high blood pressure. And we, the physicians, have changed our vocabulary about blood pressure. It used to be that you were patted on the back and told 160 was okay. We don't do that anymore because, and we're going to talk about that. Eat well and avoid obesity. But number 3, in addition to blood pressure, diabetes, smoking, there are all kinds of vascular risk factors that must be avoided if you want to protect the vascular supply of your brain. Eat well, avoid obesity, keep moving, make life hard. We're going to talk about that in detail, but these are the rules that we're going to talk about. You must sleep enough, and you must have a positive attitude. So, this is the book. I won't tell you the story, but this book is available, and I put the 7 rules in it to try to help people to sort of read it, follow its suggestions, and try to keep dementia as far away from you as possible. So here is rule number 1. Grow your brain's capacity for cognitive functions. I don't care that you're 77 years old. You still have to push that brain of yours to remember things, because it is so hungry for energy all the time that if there is something you haven't done for a while, it's going to shut it down. If you don't use it, it's going to be gone. And so it's very important to keep your brain active all the time. Here are some of the rules. We talk about cognitive reserve, which is that think of your memory the way you think of your bank account. If you're at a balance of 0, you're in trouble. You're either at that point going to have to build up your credit or stop spending. But you're going to have to do one or the other. And so the suggestion here is build up your credit. That means push your brain to remember. Do you remember all your children's birthdays? Okay, if they're married, do you remember their wives' or husbands' birthdays? Do you remember your grandchildren's birthdays? If you don't, make a list of the 20 most important people in your life and keep testing yourself. Keep remembering. Cognitive reserve, we talked about Sudoku. I have nothing against Sudoku, I swear. But it can't be the only game in town. You've got to have variety and persistently do so. There are other ways to stimulate your brain's cognitive functions. If you don't speak French, hey, what the hell are you waiting for? This is your opportunity. Go become bilingual. You're bilingual already? Okay, how about trilingual? Why? Because with every additional language that you learn, you introduce resistance to dementia into your brain. And so you can imagine as many things to do to keep your brain pushed as I can, but I gave a few ideas. Writing, not texting. Why is it not texting? Because the damn thing spells the word for you before you're done. And so I want you to keep spelling. I want you to keep teasing your brain. Reading, memorizing, calculating. If every time you're asked to do a subtraction, you pull out your iPhone and you punch in the numbers, you know what? You're going to forget how to calculate. Because the brain says, hey, she hasn't used that little spot in a while. I'm shutting it down. So that's a very important message about keeping the brain active. Planning, mapping, joining a choir. I won't take all your time on this, but if you think about what goes into singing in a choir, where you not only have to translate the notes into music that your brain then checks against what comes out of your mouth, but you also have to coordinate with the people around you. That's a very significant demand on your brain. So joining a choir is an important way to contribute to your brain's cognitive reserve. It was these nuns that taught us this. These nuns allowed us to, first of all, test them while they were alive, look at their brains after they died, and we looked at their brains, and 61 of them had the brain full of these proteins that are supposed to be toxic. They had 61 of them met the pathological criteria when we looked at their brain of having Alzheimer's disease, but only 35 of them had any memory difficulty because they had protected their vascular supply. So you can coexist with normal brain function despite the presence of these proteins in your brain. Number 2, do not allow your brain to get damaged. So not only are you building the reserve, building the positive side of the ledger, but you're going to try to avoid the negative side of the ledger. And most importantly, prevent and treat strokes. And this is where Dean Eidelman so kindly referred to the efforts of the Canadian Stroke Network in this regard. So I'm going to take a minute to talk about this. But here's a patient whose stroke was not treated. And so this is the CT scan, not the patient. And here is a major area of damage in the brain. This used to have brain just like this side and is now fluid. The brain is gone. So this patient did not get treated and helped when he or she developed a stroke. And so symptomatic stroke is a major cause of dementia. Cognitive decline is present in 61% of all symptomatic strokes within a period of 3 months. And as they get longer and longer, it gets worse and worse. And the risk of dementia increases with time after stroke. The major understanding that began to occur about stroke began in the 1980s and 1990s. And the major advance was to define, to basically say that stroke, when it happens, raises hell in the brain, but the deficit that the patient shows, feels, or is evident on examination, that deficit initially, when the stroke first happens, is coming from two things. It's coming from an area of brain that has been injured beyond repair, but additionally, it is coming from an area of the brain that isn't getting enough blood to function properly, so it stops function. The patient feels deficits due to that part of the brain, but it isn't dead. It is just getting enough blood to survive, but not to function. And it is called the penumbra. And here is a graph that I'm happy to tell you I built while I was in this institute. Basically, it says, you saw that little red head that says that this organ, called the brain, is getting a lot of blood. And when you're sitting here normally, every 100 grams of brain is getting 50 milligrams every minute. 50 milliliters every minute of blood is washing every 100 grams of brain. And you're doing fine. Even as the blood flow goes down, you're having absolutely no problem, because the brain extracts more oxygen and extracts more glucose from the remaining trickle of blood, and you're not even aware that there is anything wrong with you until you get down to about 20. Any part of the brain that is getting 20 or less milliliters per 100 grams per minute is going to go on the blink, survive, but not function. And we called it the penumbra. Between 20 and 12, the brain is alive, but it isn't working. And below 12, it dies very quickly, resulting in that little gaping hole that I showed you in that CT scan. But the important message was that when the patient has an arm that is suddenly weak, speech that is suddenly bad, and a leg that is dragging, only the arm weakness may be due to brain that is irreversibly injured, but the other deficits may be due to brain that is just holding its breath, and it is reversible. And the great majority of strokes occur because of a blood clot that goes up into the brain and blocks the blood supply to a region of brain. And that region now has a mixture of dead and holding its breath tissue. So somebody said, wait a minute, you mean, what if I busted that clot? Yeah, if you bust the clot, the part of the brain that was holding its breath is going to get back to work, and all of a sudden, deficits will reverse. Not all of them, because the ones that are due to the part of the brain that was irreversible, that was damaged, is not going to come back. That's the hole that I showed on the CT scan. But the rest of the brain, when it gets its blood supply, stops holding its breath, and all of a sudden the arm gets better, or the leg gets better, or the speech comes back. And so we got the exciting possibility, and this was 1995. NINDS, this is the American organization that studies neurology, that made a study showing that it is possible to have a patient get this drug called TPA, and all of a sudden there is recovery of function. Function comes back after a stroke. It's not forever, so we had to hurry up. And we came up with the mnemonic that time was brain, because you had to hurry the hell up and get the patient to where the drug can be given so that blood flow can be restored to the blood, to the brain. And so that was the study. And so this was 1995. in 2000, because stuff was not happening in this country fast enough, we decided to go for something called the Canadian Stroke Network, which I will tell you about. And we got approved in the year 2000. In the year 2000, 5 years after a drug that could be miraculous for stroke patients was invented, only 1% of Canadians was getting it. Only 1% of Canadians with a stroke were getting this drug. And we thought, this is not right. Something needs to be done. And so we applied for the Canadian Stroke Network and we got it. So let me tell you about Canadian Stroke, about networks of centers of excellence, because it is something that all of us as Canadians should be very proud of. It's a Canadian invention. No other country has networks of centers of excellence. And so this is something that we in the Stroke Network took advantage of, because it says, hey, mobilize multidisciplinary research capacity from across Canada. Get somebody in Vancouver to work with somebody in Halifax. And so 1 + 1 can equal 3. I know the math doesn't work, but you get the idea. It's getting people to work together. And so engaging partners, both from academic institutions and drug companies, pharmaceutical companies, research organizations. And the one in red was the one that really we wanted to take advantage of, because it is working with patients. It is working with physicians. It is working with emergency room physicians. It is working with paramedics and people who drive the ambulance. It was all of that. And so we put all this together. And as Dean Eidelman said, one of the first things we did was to look around for partners to work with. And the Heart and Stroke Foundation was a natural partner, but it was the Heart and Stroke Foundation. And so we sat down with them and said, hey, wait a minute, you've got a treatable condition here. Please, let's work together. So we worked together, and as we began to push barriers and push frontiers, I became convinced that you were going to find my body floating in the Ottawa River, because I was making enemies right, left, and center. And so we said, this is, number one, this is an emergency. Taking a stroke patient to the hospital is an emergency. And paramedics said, we don't do emergency for strokes. There's nothing to do. Yes, there is something. Can we invite you to take a course? And so we sat them down and we said, there is something here so please turn on your lights and turn on your sirens when you get a call that a patient has had a stroke. And then they would do that, and they would take the patient to a hospital that didn't have a CT scan, that didn't have a neurologist. And we started to say, not all hospitals can take care of stroke patients. And we started to categorize hospitals. Multiple meetings with all kinds of, oh boy, you should have seen the politicians who went at me, because you want to do what? You want to take room in our emergency rooms for patients, for stroke patients? You want to bring them into the intensive care unit? You know, it was like unheard of. So, Dr. Hakim, stroke patients never leave the hospital. What the hell are you trying to do? So that was the kind of discourse that was going on. And I must say, I have just had a visit to this hospital and heard the amazing accomplishments of this hospital with Jeanne Teitelbaum and so many others, and how you have come incredibly far in taking care of stroke patients. So congratulations. The other thing that the Heart and Stroke Foundation did was to educate the public. Because people used to say, well, my leg dragged all of a sudden, so I went to bed to see if it would get better in the morning. And so, you know, my speech was a little slow, so I decided to wait a little bit before doctors are busy, I don't want to bother them. So they came up with this, if the face is drooping or the arm is going down when you hold them up and one of them goes like this, or the speech is slurred, don't wait. Also, don't get that person into your car to drive them to an emergency room, because you don't know which emergency room you need to get to. call 911 and have the paramedics, have the ambulance come up and pick that patient up. We categorized hospitals as a local hospital, meaning they don't have a CT scan and they don't have a neurologist, and they should not be in the business of taking care of stroke patients. You wouldn't believe the number of angry hospital directors who called me and said, "What the hell do you mean? We've taken care of stroke patients for 100 years, and now you're saying they can't come to my hospital anymore? Who the hell are you?" And also, some of my own colleagues put their arm up at the back of the room when I would talk about this, and they'd say, "We know why you're pushing TPA, because you're on the take from the drug company." And I didn't even know which goddamn drug company made the stuff. But still, so all of this was not easy. So we developed best practice guidelines. Best practice guidelines means we read the entire literature, we summarized it, and we distilled it into advice to my colleagues in the emergency room, to my colleagues, the neurologists, to my colleagues everywhere, because this was the message that the research was teaching us. And so we developed these best practice guidelines. And here's what it said. Stroke patients used to come to the emergency room and wait, and they would be taken in after the heel that was in pain, or the patient who had fallen and hurt his knee. And so we said, 1 minute. First of all, the patient, we hope, recognizes that this is a stroke, or a family member calls the paramedics, and the paramedics put on their sirens and put on their lights and rush over there, and they know which hospital to take the patient to, and they get to that hospital. From the moment they arrive, and that 1 minute is all you've got from the moment they arrive to when that patient is taken under the wing of the emergentologist. Door to doctor, door to stroke team notification. I mean, in any hospital now, what you hear is on the PA, stroke code, 8 people are mobilized when that term is announced. And coming down to the emergency room to take care of the stroke patients. Door to CT scan, door to TPA, 1 hour please. And during that 1 hour, the brain has lost a lot of cells, which now cannot hold their breath anymore, but there is still a lot of brain to save. And all of a sudden, the miracle of seeing the deficits disappear was what all of us were observing. And so I'm proud to tell you that we went from less than 1% in 1995 to as many patients as deserve to get TPA were getting it, because not everybody is going to get TPA. The arm may fall because of a hemorrhage in the brain, and those patients will not get TPA. So not everybody who suddenly develops a neurological deficit is going to get TPA. And the maximum, we think, is somewhere around 50% to 60%. Welcome to the world of the Montreal Neurological Institute, where we can now avoid the length of time that TPA takes to melt a clot. We don't want to take that time, so now they thread a little catheter that finds the clot and hooks it and pulls it out. And when you do that, you can do it, and the brain says thank you because it's been holding its breath for 12 hours. And even now, when the deficit is a lot bigger, suggests that a large part of the brain is in trouble, and you get the CT scan and you see a little tiny part of the brain that is irreversibly injured, that says a lot of that brain is in the penumbra zone, and if you see that, you have up to 24 hours to still go in there and pull the clot out. I am not suggesting for a minute that you sit at home and wait for 24 hours. I'm saying get to an emergency room and let the emergency room people decide what is the right treatment for you, because we now have both TPA and we can go in with an interventional radiologist, go in and drag that clot out. So, this is a thinly populated country when you get out of the big cities. And so one of the first things that happened was people in remote regions said, excuse me, what about me? I remember meeting with the Minister of Health in Newfoundland, and when we were pushing the Canadian Stroke Network, and he said, Dr. Hakim, this is a have province. We have more CT scans per population than any other province in the country. They had money to buy the equipment. They didn't have the people to read it. So what we did was to set them up with telestroke so that the image could be obtained in a remote region, but it is sent electronically, interpreted in a big center, and a decision is made in the big center, and then they have a technician who can start the IV and get it going. So these were all the things that we, and as Dean Eidelman, he told you a lot about this slide, there were a number of other benefits from all of a sudden people becoming aware that stroke is treatable, but more importantly, preventable if you control the vascular risk factors. And so there was really a change in the attitude with number of stroke patients admitted in Ontario. I know that the same is true in a number of other provinces, including Quebec. It decreased by 11%, not because we cured strokes, it's because the number of people who were going to the prevention clinics had gone up by 34%, so we were preventing strokes from happening, and so admissions of stroke patients was coming down. All of that was about strokes that the patient felt, only to discover that there are many, many strokes that occur and patients do not feel them. And the reason they don't feel them is that they're tiny, they're small, and the arm doesn't fall, and the leg doesn't drag, and the speech doesn't disappear, but they are incredibly harmful nonetheless. And so that small vessel disease is the big piece under the large vessel disease, which is the part that I've been talking about up to now. And so what they cause are strokes, but the strokes are covert. The patient is not aware of them. So this is becoming something that is increasingly important for us to be aware of, that covert strokes may be going on in your brain now, and you wouldn't feel it, but cumulatively, they cause trouble. Number one, they occur at up to 10 times the frequency of the evident strokes. And this is what they look like. Remember the picture that the CT scan that I showed with the big hole due to an obvious stroke that occurred, but a large vessel stroke. But here's a small vessel stroke. Here's one. Here's a whole bunch of them. This patient, this one on the right, is not going to be thinking clearly. Is going to have, my brain is in a fog all the time kind of complaint. But you examine them, the arm doesn't fall, the speech is not slurred, the leg doesn't drag, but they are in deep doo-doo because of the fact that these small blood vessels are getting blocked off. So small vessel disease has serious consequences. In the brain, they cause infarcts, hyperintensities in the white matter, microbleeds, brain atrophy, and small vessel disease is associated with strokes. Yes, those who get the big ones also get the small ones, and vice versa. Psychiatric decline, gait abnormalities, and dementia, and this is why I talk about them here. And outside of the brain, this is a systemic disease. It's a disease that affects the small blood vessels in the brain, but also, remember that picture of the red head? What other organs were really red? The kidney, the eyes, and the lungs. People who have small vessel disease have a systemic problem that leads them to have dialysis because their kidneys failed, leads them to have difficulty with muscle activity because muscle is a very vascular organ. It leads them to blindness. And what do? We're spending every subspecialist time taking care of one problem called small vessel disease. I'll give you a whole lecture about how we could reorganize medicine to take care of this problem now that we've organized large vessel disease, but that's for another day. And so this is a very significant problem, small vessel disease. And the reason for that is that small vessel disease affects, is observed more and more as we get older. It is associated with lower volume of brain white matter and are associated with worse performance on cognitive tests, and they increase the risk of dementia fourfold. It's very important to avoid this problem. The etiology of the big stroke, that hole on the CT scan, the etiology, how it happens is that we said it's a blood clot. This is a large vessel problem, and small vessels get into trouble because of inflammation that occurs in the blood. And that's an important word that you need to remember, and we're going to come back to it. Small vessel disease happens for the same risk factors that cause large vessel disease, but in addition, the small blood vessels can be victims of something called inflammation in the blood. By the way, you can save your question to the end. Et aussi, je dois vous dire que si parmi vous, il y a des francophones qui veulent poser des questions, ça me fera plaisir de vous en parler à la fin de mon allocution. So somebody actually, the same way that they looked at who gets large vessel disease, people looked at who gets small vessel disease. And boy, was it really something that was very educational. Because the people who look at the big numbers as you go down this column. People who have big strokes also have small strokes because they have vascular risk factors. So small vessel disease happens from the vascular risk factors. But in addition, people with depression get small vessel disease. People with renal failure, we know why. People with renal failure get small vessel disease. People with diabetes, because it's a very inflammatory condition, get small vessel disease in the brain. And so people with vascular risk factors also get small vessel disease in the brain. Anyone harboring a vascular risk factor, and by now you know them by heart. The big one for me is high blood pressure. So control your blood pressure. But if you're a smoker, if you're diabetic and it's uncontrolled, if you're obese, etc., all of these are vascular risk factors that cause both large and small vessel disease and chronic insufficient sleep and loneliness. So we're going to talk about that. But I mean, this was part of the one who benefited the most from writing the book is because I all of a sudden started to learn about these things that I've now transmitted them to you in my book. But loneliness is a vascular risk factor. Wow. What about lack of sleep? We're going to talk about that. So let's move on from things that directly injure the brain to things that secondarily injure the brain. We have come a long way in our appreciation of hypertension. And if you're somebody who measures your blood pressure in the pharmacy, forget it. I want you to invest to buy a cuff that you take home. And when you are quiet, unstressed, your husband is not after you, and the kids are not giving you hell, you sit in your room quietly and you calm yourself down and you put the cuff on and you measure the blood pressure. The higher number, as you know, there are two numbers. The higher number when you're calm should not be more than 120. We do not pat patients on the back and say, oh, it's 160, you're okay. You must have been stressed. Yes, blood pressure is designed to go up when you're stressed. Blood pressure is designed to go up when you're hassled. But that is not the number that I'm looking for. I'm looking for the blood pressure when you're totally calm. And there is a very important reason for this. Conditions that are associated with small vessel disease, with brain small vessel disease, this is we're forever grateful to Sarah Vermeer, who said, who gets these things? Who gets these small blood vessel occlusions in the brain? And she looked at it, and it turned out that patients with 43% of people with high blood pressure have these things in their brains. And it goes on. So the list is long. There will be other opportunities for us to talk about the other things in that list, but it's very important that you avoid hypertension because it is a major driver of small vessel disease in the brain. This graph grabs me because even though it's old, here's what it says. If you invite me to your house when you are in your 50s and I measure your blood pressure and I come back 25 years later and I measure and I test you for your brain function, your memory function, your cognitive function, here's what it says. For every millimeter of blood pressure more than 140, we used to think, you have a 1% chance of becoming demented over time. 120 is the maximum you should allow the systolic blood pressure to be when you are at rest, because over time, it gums up the works if you let it be persistently higher than that. A lot of my family physician colleagues do not forgive me for saying this. And here's the reason. If you bring it down too rapidly, or if you forget to drink liquids, and somebody is trying to bring your blood pressure down, then when you stand up from your seat, you can get dizzy. And they say, and they fall and they break their hips, Dr. Hakim. Well, you know what? This is an education problem. It's not a blood pressure problem. Because what happens as we get older is that we lose our sense of thirst. We are not thirsty, even though we are dry as a twig. And so I say to my patients, the formula is bring your blood pressure so that the systolic is at 120. You drink a glass of water per hour. What? I don't drink 3 glasses the whole day. Well, you drink a glass of water per hour, and if you don't drink it every hour, you want to do it every 2 hours, it's 2 glasses of water. And stop by 6 o'clock so you're not up going to the bathroom all the time at night, but I want you well hydrated. That prevents treatment of your hypertension to a level of 120 from becoming a problem. So it's an issue of education, not an issue of allowing blood pressure to climb because I don't want you falling. Here's the problem with hypertension. This is the data from 94 to 2005, and the reason we stopped at 2005 is that you elected Mr. Harp, yes, and he said, I don't want data anymore, I don't want to poison my ideas with information. So, I'm sorry. Blood pressure is going up in the population. It is significantly elevated in males between the ages of 12 to 34. Young people are having high blood pressure for a variety of reasons, which you can guess at as well as I can. And so hypertension is growing as a problem, and that is one of the major vascular risk factors, but there are others, and I encourage you to look up what are the vascular risk factors. They were in those tables that I showed you, and I've mentioned a number of them. High cholesterol, diabetes, smoking, all of that. So, but we talk about blood pressure because it is the most damaging to the brain of all of the vascular risk factors. Rule number 4. You didn't know I was a poet, did you? Eat right, weigh light, and stay bright. Wow, it took me a whole day to come up with this. I want to say something that's very important. This is not about body shaming. I respect and love my patient regardless of her or his weight. But increasingly, we talk about obesity as a disease. It's not just the way you look, it's a disease. And the percent of adults 20 years and older who are considered obese, as you see in this graph, is climbing all the time. And there are many reasons for this. Some that we control, some that our municipalities control, some that our federal government controls. And shame on all of us for not doing the right thing to try to control this major problem. Again, trends in obesity, yes, we are getting heavier and heavier all the time. And both males and females, I must say, this is significant if it's less than 0.05. And you can see that both sexes between the age of 12 and 34 are having a significant and growing problem with obesity. Midlife overweight and obesity increase late life dementia risk. This is not about body shaming. This is about talking about a condition that makes it more likely for you to become demented as you get older. And so, both overweight and obesity at midlife independently increase the risk of dementia as you get older. And it keeps me up at night thinking that between the age of 12 and 34, there has now been a significant increase in the percentage of obese individuals in those young age categories. This is a complicated issue, but let me just touch on a few things. If you are obese and you have this big abdomen, that is not cold storage. That is not just a way of accumulating calories in the abdomen. That abdominal obesity is productive of inflammatory cytokines and other molecules that go and poison your brain. This is the only reason increasingly we talk about obesity not just as a way you look, but also as a disease. It's increasingly talked about as a disease. And that's the reason why. And I'm going to touch on just a couple of things since I made reference to our governments and the way they could help us with this. And here's something that you could do. I'm not going to go into this graph in a big way, but it says that if the quality of the food that you feed your child or grandchild is good when they are babies, they are much less likely to become obese when they get older. This is something that you and I have some control over because as a grandmother or as a grandfather or as a father or mother, what you feed your kid when they are 2 years old, they're going to grow to like when they are older and they're going to seek it. It's just the way we're programmed, I'm sorry. So if you fed me hot dogs and potato chips when I was 2 years old because it entertained me. You just put it on my little tray and you went away to do your thing. I'm going to grow up to be liking hot dogs and potato chips. And so that could be a problem. Here's another one that I like. If you go to the store and you're going to buy a soft drink, and you read the label because you're a good person and you want to read the label, it says there's 250 calories in this bottle. And you say, okay. But what if I said to you, and this is the bottom of the slide, if you drink this bottle, it's going to take you walking 5 miles to neutralize the calories that you just consumed. And people walk away from the bottle. If you say 250 calories, they buy it. If you say you're going to have to walk 5 miles, they say, whoa, I don't want to do this. So how we talk to the public, and this is a message to our governments. You know, the soft drink industry doesn't think of me as their friend. But I mean, this is the problem. It's not about the industry. The industry is going to put out whatever they think you will buy. But it's responsibility of the government to translate that information in a way that you and I understand. You want to hear the latest craze in the US? It's a pie. It's a whole pie. It has only 2 ingredients: bacon and chocolate. If I want to make that pie, it's my business, and don't tell me that I cannot make it. This is not Russia. But if I sell it then maybe you should tax it, because that person who's buying it, and you should have seen the line to buy this, that person is going to end up in the hospital. And so somebody has to pay for this. And just because I made a pie that is a poison to people, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't add on to it something that pays for the health care that these people are going to require. Here's one for all of us. It's not just what we eat. How we eat also matters. So they did a study, which is represented here, in which they divided people into two groups. One group was busy while they're eating with stuff, and the other group paid attention. And guess what? The memory that people had who were busy of what they ate was not as good as the memory of what they ate was for people who paid attention to what they're eating. So if you are busy doing other stuff, you wouldn't believe the number of people in my hospital who are on their iPhones while they're eating. What happens is that the stomach is full, but the brain is hungry. The brain says, you didn't feed me. I didn't taste anything. And so as these people, as this slide shows, these people then go back to eating more because, hey, the brain says, you didn't feed me. Don't do that. Don't do that. So if everybody is on an iPhone or has earphones while we're eating, we are not paying attention to what we're eating, and this comes back to hurt us. Rule number 5. There's 3 more, 5, 6, and 7. Move your hind to save your mind. I couldn't find anything that rhymed with ass, so. What is this picture telling you? I'll tell you what this picture is telling me. We do not take advantage of opportunities that are offered to us all day long to move our asses and to be physically active. These guys are going in, they're going to sweat and work hard, and here's this opportunity that they could have burnt a few calories going up the stairs instead of taking the escalator. What I'm saying is we need to be more aware of our environment and use it. Don't let me catch any of you taking the elevator for anything less than 4 floors. Are you going to be out of breath by the 2nd floor? Yes, if you haven't done it. But if you do it enough, you're going to be out of breath only on the 3rd floor and then only on the 4th floor. And by the way, getting out of breath is the message to your brain that you are doing something that is physically active. So going for a walk, I have nothing against going for a walk. But if you go for a walk and you don't get out of breath, your brain doesn't get the message that you're now physically active. So get out of breath once a day. It's not hard to do. You can walk around your house fast and get out of breath. Just don't trip on the carpet and blame it on me. Your brain needs a minimum of 10 minutes per day of being physically active. Prefers 30 minutes a day of being physically active. And this isn't about working in your garden. I have nothing against you working in your garden, but it usually doesn't get you out of breath. The brain wants you to pant. No, not that kind of panting. The brain wants you to pant because you're exercising. And so I have some ideas, but I don't take my ideas. Come up with your own ideas of how you're going to get out of breath. But taking the stairs instead of the elevators, you know, people, we've all seen them in a shopping center. They drive around, they're waiting for that parking spot close to the door. Hey, lots of space over at the other end of the parking lot, and jog to the door while you're at it. You know, you'll be all right. So, why? Why am I going into this? Because of this bold headline that says, exercise training makes your brain grow and makes your memory centers in your brain grow. It isn't just about being fit. It turns out when you move those muscles, They put out hormones that go to your brain and make it healthier. Hey, I didn't know this until I wrote this book, but it was incredibly valuable to me to start digging into the literature and to discover that your brain talks to your muscles and vice versa. And so it is very important to be physically active to keep your brain in good shape. Even when you inherited the predisposition to Alzheimer's disease, genetically inherited the tendency to accumulate those toxic proteins, if you exercise, the proteins accumulate less in the brains of those people compared to other people who have the same predisposition but do not exercise. Because when you increase blood flow to the brain, it does two things. It doesn't just bring energy, it also washes out the crap that has accumulated in the brain, because it's a very active, energy demanding organ. And like a car that has 12 cylinders with the accelerator on the floor all the time, it needs frequent tune-ups. And blood flow to the brain, even when you genetically inherited a tendency towards Alzheimer's disease, is what washes away those nasty proteins. And so, the reason it's important to talk about sleep is that sleep is when your brain turns on the cleaning mechanisms that take away the proteins that have accumulated. It happens during wakeful hours also, but especially during sleep. So, sleep adequacy, yay or nay, impacts cognition one way or the other. Remember that even when we lived in tents, our great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, and they were surrounded by lions and other things that could eat them, they still had to sleep. There is a reason for that. It is absolutely essential for the health of the brain to be able to fall asleep adequately. During sleep is when you consolidate memory. The high consumption of energy produces many toxic molecules, but sleep is the opportunity for a nightly tune-up. And during sleep, the repair of the brain that was damaged during the day is when it revs up, and white matter repair is revved up, and drainage of the toxic molecules occur, and sleep deprivation accelerates atrophy of the brain. If you are a leader of a country and you only sleep 4 hours or 5 hours because you need to get on your Twitter, don't expect to make too much sense. Socialize and feel useful. Loneliness and depression can make you crazy. And this is the last rule, but it's also a sad one, because we collectively sometimes unknowingly contribute to this. If your neighbor of many years lost her husband, and you say, oh, leave her alone, she's sad, I don't want to bother her, she is getting lonelier and lonelier. And so that's when loneliness becomes a toxic environment. And so, again, our municipalities can do things about this. Our families can do things about this. Our governments can do things about this. Loneliness, it turns out, if it leads to depression, it is also an inflammatory process. It makes the molecules rush to the brain and burn up the brain cells that we have. So it is very important to recognize that people with depression, half of them had small vessel disease in the brain. Half of them. Depression is a toxic environment to the brain. And I put this together some years ago because it was very important to recognize that depression is not just sadness. It also has significant consequences to the brain by changing the structure of the white matter, by producing inflammatory molecules, and also the heartbeat beats a little slower when we are sad, and so there are what I call hemodynamic consequences to sadness. All of that leads to small vessel disease and to strokes and can lead to dementia. And you know, dementia can then also make people depressed when they can't figure things out. And so it becomes a very important problem, and it's important to be aware of it. And here's the awful part of it: antidepressant medication does not neutralize the inflammatory pathways. So it ain't enough. You need friendship, you need music, you need collegiality, you need neighbors, you need people to say that they love you. And so, I'm done. Here are the 7 rules, and you can read them and enjoy them. And if you don't have time to read them, then you can go to the bookstore. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that masterful presentation. There were lots of important messages in there. It's now my pleasure to ask people who have questions. We have a microphone in the back, and we have Sarah here who has a microphone for people who can't get to the back. I want to take this as a perfect segue for me to thank Sarah Stack and Dimitra Kafantaris and Anna Colby, who helped organize today's talk. So I saw Mr.
I want to thank them as well, because they were just incredible the way they organized me. I can tell you every step is counted.
So Mr. Right over here, Mr. Goldstein has a question.
Your talk emphasized the importance of healthy lifestyles, but I must say you said very little about why so few of us have healthy lifestyles. There must be reasons other than just sheer ignorance to explain why so many of us have such poor habits of eating and lack of sleep and lack of exercise and all kinds of other things. So could you say anything about the causes of our bad behavior?
Well, I think it's called civilization. And you may or may not agree with that term, but to go to work, you wake up in the morning and you're rushed, and you get in your car and you drive for an hour to get to work. At work, you sit on your butt all day long. You go for lunch, you sit and eat, and sometimes you sit and eat with your iPhone, and then you go back to work and you sit at your desk, and then you get in your car and drive an hour to get home, and by the time you get home, you're so tired, you sit in front of the TV and watch TV all day long. How am I doing? So, look, we have to fight this. My message, and the most important message, is this is up to you. This is up to you. We are giving you iPhones so you never have to spell a word anymore. We are putting a voice in your dashboard so that when you want to go from point A to point B, she tells you when to turn, and when to turn right, and when to turn left. And all of that is putting the brain to rest. And that's the worst thing that the brain can do. So look around you, figure out what are all the things that are causing you to break the 7 rules, and fight them back.
Thank you, Dr. Hakim. I wish more people, engineers, would go into medicine with that kind of a lecture. What do you say for an octogenarian that plays hockey twice a week, but lacks a little bit of sleep, and you say you can't take medicine to help your brain regarding sleeping? And other things too that octogenarians do.
Well, so this is an important problem. And there are, number one, I want to emphasize what you said. Sleeping pills don't do it, for a variety of reasons. But what you need to do, and again, I go into this in my book, not that I'm pushing my book, but I go into this in my book to some extent, because one of the things that people tell me really works for them is to develop a pattern of behavior in the half hour before they go to bed. In other words, it's got to be the same thing that you do every night before you go to bed. You check that the front door is locked, you check that the back door is locked, you go into the kitchen and you do something, and it's got to be the same sequence, because while you're doing that sequence, the brain says, oh, he's going to bed, so I better get ready. And that, in fact, does happen. The other reason for the octogenarian is he probably gets up to go to the bathroom a couple of times a night.
3 times.
3 times. Yeah.
4.
Yeah. And that's incredibly disruptive. Yes. But did you know you could train your bladder? I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you.
I was just putting a plug for, as in my respirologist hat, that some people have sleep apnea, okay, and when you have, if you do have that, if your loved one says that you're stopping breathing at night or things like that, that can actually make you go to the bathroom more often, and it disrupts your sleep. And if that's the case, getting that treated will help improve your sleep quality and do all the things. That's another thing. There's no evidence that it prevents strokes, but it certainly makes you feel better. It probably does prevent strokes, but
There's a question here.
Okay, go ahead.
Kind of interesting, because my question was regarding sleep apnea. I have sleep apnea. Does that give me a higher incidence of perhaps developing cognitive problems? And the fact that I'm presently using a CPAP, just beginning to, will that make a difference?
CPAP is the solution. And so, and it takes some getting used to, as you probably would attest. But it's sleep apnea is very important, as Dean Eidelman said. And maybe I should remember to include it in my talks, because often the person who has sleep apnea, what does it mean? It means that during sleep, you stop breathing for a short period of time. The brain becomes deoxygenated. It ain't happy. And it wakes you up because you're now choking. And so you wake up. And so you are awakened multiple times. Even sometimes you don't wake up enough to be aware that you're awake, but your brain woke up even though you're still asleep. And the other person who suffers is anybody sleeping next to you, because sleep apnea people are also heavy snorers. And so it's very important to keep that in mind. And absolutely, there is a solution for it, which you're following.
I would just say that snoring is not always sleep apnea, as I learned in my own family. You can do the sleep study and find out people just snore, and that's a different thing. So not everybody who snores. It's sleep apnea patients snore, not all snorers have sleep apnea. Other questions? So I have a question about blood pressure, and it's based on an editorial in this week's New England Journal, which is, there's a lot of controversy over your statement that blood pressures should always be below 120 systolic, which is, of course, wonderful if possible, but there aren't very many people statistically walking around naturally with blood pressures below 120 systolic, and certainly not among people over 50. So there is some controversy, and the new guidelines suggest that this is what should be done, but between 120 and 140, they suggest lifestyle changes rather than medication. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, because that's a little bit on the edge.
So there was a major study called the SPRINT study that was done, in which they compared heart attacks and strokes occurring in two groups of people, ones whose systolic was maintained at 120 and ones whose systolic blood pressure was maintained at 140. This is an NIH study. Guess what? The study had to be, and in these NIH studies, there's a secret group of people who are collecting the data and looking at it, and they said, stop the study, because there is no reason to continue. The difference between those two groups in heart attacks and strokes is so much lower in the 120 group than in the 140 group, that from now on, yes, it is still controversial. There was one study, but it was a study that was very, very important. And the other thing is that just because your blood pressure is above 120 somewhere between 120 and 140, you still have control over your blood pressure, and you can do some things to bring it down. A lot of the things that we talked about today, exercising, losing some weight. Hey, if I have a big abdomen, it is squeezing my blood vessels, and guess what happens to pressure when the blood vessels are squeezed? It goes up. So there are things that we can do to bring down our blood pressure. But if you're not willing to go there, then there has to be treatment to bring your blood pressure down.
So let me follow that up and say, what if you do all those things and your blood pressure is, let's say, I don't know, 125 or 130?
Look, I mean, this controlling your blood pressure doesn't need to be a toxic thing where you're just all the time worrying about it. If you were 140 and you're now to 125, congratulations. You have saved your brain from a lot of trouble. I don't mean to say that it has to be 120 and not 121. And if it's 118, you're in deep trouble. No. There is room. But by and large, for most of us, the goal is when we are at rest, the systolic blood pressure should be 120, and there is still some controversy about that.
That was the answer I was looking for. Excellent. So, any other questions? I see hands over here, Sarah.
I didn't see where you were pointing.
Well, I don't know if we can put on the lights, maybe, I don't know how to control the lights, I apologize.
Oh, sorry. There's someone here.
Okay.
Somebody there?
Okay.
Somebody there?
And there's a person at the mic, so why don't we take the person at the mic first and then the person over here? I didn't see the person at the mic. Go ahead.
Okay.
Person at the mic. Yeah.
Yes.
So all of you are going to ask questions between you and supper.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we'll take two more questions. Go
Yes,
ahead.
I really like your take on a positive attitude. I think that's something I believe in quite a lot. What I'd really like to know is, does humor also have an impact on health? Does humor, the use
Jokes.
of humor, jokes, having a funny attitude? No! Ah, that's good.
Maybe not sarcasm, but true humor is incredibly helpful. I mean, people talk about do we as a westernized society have a lot of opportunity for humor? Not really. We read the jokes in the paper, but that's not enough. But if you want to see humor, watch a bunch of people in Italy sitting together having dinner and then laughing all the time, and the same thing.
Their food is better. They have better food. I think that's part of it. There was another comment over here somewhere. Oh, there it is. Okay, who has the microphone?
Yes.
You talked about stroke and vascular events. Macular degeneration, I hate to have another diagnosis, but I've heard about hospitalization being a factor in vascular degeneration. And I just wondered if there was any studies correlating macular degeneration to these other two factors.
Absolutely. So, I've said that small vessel disease is a systemic condition. It affects every organ in the body that gets perfused at a high rate. And your eye the retina is very much a victim of small vessel disease. And this is so small vessel disease can not only lead to dementia, it can lead to renal failure, failure of the kidneys, it can also lead to blindness. And it can also lead to muscle trouble and lung trouble because these are all highly vascular parts of our body.
In fact, isn't it correct that the retina is a projection of the brain, essentially, into the back of the eye? I think this gentleman has the last question here.
I'd like to start by saying thank you very much for the presentation. It was very informative, and I'm going to make this very quick because I don't want to be the person standing between the question and everybody's dinner. So I recently had a concussion, and I was just wondering where concussions fit in the sort of realm of risk factors for dementia.
Yeah.
Again, I don't want to stand in between people's dinners,
No,
but
so look, it's very important. So let me give you the main rules about concussions. Sometimes concussions are unavoidable because you were skiing and you fell, or I'm not going to talk about football players who, you know, they do it because whatever, it's their profession or something. But I mean, it's crazy what they go through. And I've had a couple of sports people where concussion is part of the deal. And my prediction is that, don't quote me here because the hockey people will come after me. These games are either going to have to reduce significantly the rate of concussion or they're going to be declared illegal. So concussions are a significant way of damaging white matter in the brain. Look, your brain is the only organ in your body that we put in a tight box. No other part of you, no matter how important you think it is in a tight box. And the reason for that is the brain does not like to be logged around. It goes into this major consequence of moving back and forth, and every one of these is injuring white matter. And so sometimes concussions are unavoidable if you're not a football player or a hockey player, because you're a sportsman and you ski or you slipped and fell or whatever. Very important. One, not to sit at home for too long babying it, but get back out there. Number two, at all costs, avoid a second event too close to the first event, because then the demons are out. So concussions are a very, if they're repetitive, they will lead to dementia. And Muhammad Ali is my hero about the example of how repeated concussions. What the hell are we doing still boxing? And what are we doing enjoying watching boxing? I walk out of the room. I can't stand it.
So on that note, I think we're going to stop. I think I'm going to excellent. And we're going to take a picture. We have just turn it that way. We've got the paparazzi here. So congratulations and thank you very much. That was great.